The morning mist hung low over the Oxfordshire countryside on July 2, 1892. The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that makes stone walls sweat and turns formal gardens into shimmering mirages. At Blenheim Palace, servants moved through corridors wide enough to drive carriages through, preparing for another day in service to one of England's most powerful dynasties. The kitchens were already blazing. The silver was being polished. And in the private apartments of the palace, a mother was about to lose her child in a way that would reshape the future of British architecture, dynastic ambition, and generational wealth forever. But before we understand the tragedy, we must first fall in love with the dream. Blenheim Palace was never meant to be ordinary. It was constructed as a gift from a grateful nation to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, after his crushing military victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The Crown didn't just hand him a country estate. They gave him £350 million in today's money, adjusted for inflation, to build a monument that would dwarf every aristocratic seat in England. The architect, Sir John Vanbrugh, designed it not as a home but as a political statement, a Baroque fortress of grandeur with 200 rooms, sweeping colonnades, and a footprint that covered 7 acres. The palace sat in the center of 2,000 acres of parkland, sculpted by Capability Brown into a landscape so idealized it looked like a painting come to life. By the late 19th century, the palace had passed through 7 generations of Marlboroughs. Each duke added his own layer of ambition. Libraries were expanded. Art collections grew. The family accumulated Titians, Rubens, Van Dycks, masterworks worth fortunes that could stabilize entire national economies. But it wasn't enough. It never is. George Charles Spencer-Churchill, the 8th Duke of Marlborough, inherited the estate in 1883, and he arrived with vision. He looked at Blenheim and saw incompleteness. The palace, for all its grandeur, lacked something the new industrial aristocracy was building into their estates: theatrical water features. The Rothschilds had their ornamental lakes. The Astors had their reflecting pools. George wanted more than that. He wanted to transform the southern grounds of Blenheim into a Venice of England, a labyrinth of interconnected waterways, islands, and a massive boathouse wing extending directly from the palace itself into a newly excavated lake. This wasn't renovation. This was reinvention. The financials were staggering. Operating costs for Blenheim already consumed roughly £12 million per year in modern currency. The estate employed over 300 staff, gamekeepers, gardeners, scullery maids, footmen, grooms, and an army of laborers who kept the grounds pristine. The Duke's plan required capital allocation on an entirely different scale. Engineers were hired to survey the land. Architects drafted blueprints for a new wing, dubbed the Lake Wing, that would house indoor swimming facilities, guest suites with water views, and a grand salon that opened directly onto a private dock. The excavation alone was projected to cost the equivalent of £40 million today. Materials, labor, landscaping, and interior finishes would push the total project budget north of £120 million. But George had the liquidity. Or so he believed. The Marlborough estates generated income from tenant farms, coal mining rights, timber sales, and dividends from industrial investments made decades earlier. On paper, the family wealth was robust. Asset allocation appeared sound. The Duke had access to lines of credit with banks that had financed the British Empire itself. The Lake Wing was approved. Construction began in the spring of 1891. If you're still here, it means you recognize that these stories are never told honestly the first time. They're polished, sanitized, and rewritten by the victors or the survivors. What follows isn't speculation. It's the result of estate records, coroner reports, and letters preserved in the Blenheim archives, evidence that only came to light decades later. These stories take time to research, and support keeps them possible. The excavation for the lake was brutal work. Hundreds of laborers were brought in from nearby villages, men who worked 12-hour days with shovels, pickaxes, and primitive earth-moving equipment. They carved into the earth south of the palace, digging down 15 feet, removing tens of thousands of cubic yards of soil and rock. The displaced earth was used to build up embankments and create artificial islands within the planned lake. The workforce was paid in shillings, barely enough to cover rent in the cramped workers' cottages at the edge of the estate. They had no safety equipment. No insurance. If a man was injured, he was replaced. If he complained, he was dismissed. The nobility didn't see these men. They didn't know their names. The system was designed that way. By the summer of 1892, the lake bed was nearly complete. Water was being diverted from the River Glyme to begin filling the basin. The new wing's foundation had been poured, and the stone walls were rising. The Duke walked the grounds with his architects and marveled at the progress. This was going to be his legacy, his addition to the dynasty. His children would inherit not just a palace but a spectacle. He had 4 children. The heir, Charles Richard John Spencer-Churchill, known as Sonny, was preparing for Eton. Lady Lillian was already being groomed for a strategic marriage. Lady Nora was still in the nursery. And then there was George. George Spencer-Churchill, the Duke's second son, was 11 years old. He was curious, energetic, and prone to wandering. Like many aristocratic children, he spent his days in the care of governesses and tutors, but Blenheim was too vast to supervise completely. The estate grounds were his playground. He climbed trees in the old forest. He explored the stables. He watched the construction of the lake with fascination. On the afternoon of July 2, George slipped away from his lessons. The heat was unbearable inside the palace, and the construction site was calling. Workers later reported seeing a boy in fine clothes walking along the newly formed embankments, looking down at the water beginning to pool in the excavation. The lake wasn't finished. The edges were unstable. The depth varied wildly, shallow in some areas, dangerously deep in others where the digging had hit underground springs. No one stopped him. At approximately 3:15 p.m., a scream cut through the summer air. A laborer saw movement in the water, thrashing, panicked. He ran toward it and realized it was the Duke's son. George had fallen in. Or jumped. The accounts conflict. What is certain is that the boy couldn't swim, and the water was deeper than it appeared. His heavy clothing dragged him down. The laborer dove in, but the embankment gave way beneath his weight, sending a cascade of mud and loose stone into the water. Visibility dropped to 0. Other workers arrived. They pulled the laborer out. Then they pulled out George. He was unconscious. A rider was sent at full speed to fetch a doctor from Woodstock, but it was too late. George Spencer-Churchill was pronounced dead at 4 p.m. The cause was drowning. The location was the unfinished lake, barely a quarter full, that his father had commissioned to crown his legacy. The gates closed. The construction stopped. Silence. Behind the velvet curtains, a family was fracturing in ways that would define the Marlborough line for the next century. The Duchess, Albertha Frances Anne, was inconsolable. Accounts from household staff describe her as nearly catatonic in the days following the drowning. She refused to eat. She wouldn't leave her chambers. She demanded that the lake be drained immediately, that the excavation be filled in, that every trace of the project be erased. The Duke, by contrast, retreated into administrative paralysis. He locked himself in his study and pored over estate documents, trying to calculate the financial damage of halting the construction midstream. The emotional toll was immeasurable. But the financial toll was precise. The Lake Wing project had already consumed approximately £60 million in modern value. Contracts with suppliers were binding. The stonemasons, iron workers, and landscape designers were owed payment for completed work. Canceling the project didn't cancel the debt. Worse, the incomplete excavation had created a liability. The half-filled lake was unstable. It flooded during heavy rains, threatening the foundation of the existing palace. Engineers were brought in to assess the damage, and their report was grim. The excavation had disrupted underground water flow, weakening the southern retaining walls. Remediation would cost an additional £20 million. The Duke had liquidity problems. His lines of credit were maxed. The income from the estate couldn't cover both the operating costs and the new debt. He began selling assets. Minor artworks went first, paintings by lesser-known Flemish masters, decorative silver, furniture from guest wings. Then he sold land. Tenant farms were auctioned off to industrialists who turned them into factories. Timber rights were sold at a loss. By 1895, the family was on the edge of insolvency. And then came the psychological shift that defines this story. The Duke blamed himself. Not for the construction project, for allowing his son near it. The guilt metastasized into obsession. He became convinced that Blenheim itself was cursed, that the palace demanded sacrifice to maintain its grandeur. He stopped sleeping. Servants reported hearing him walking the corridors at night, muttering about debts and costs. His health collapsed. In 1896, at the age of 48, George Charles Spencer-Churchill, 8th Duke of Marlborough, suffered a massive stroke. He lingered for 6 months, partially paralyzed, and died in November. The title passed to his eldest son, Sonny, who inherited not a fortune but a crisis. Sonny was 21 years old. He had Northwest training in estate management. The financial bleed was catastrophic. Operating costs were still $12 million per year. The estate's income had dropped to $8 million after the land sales. The deficit was being financed by loans with interest rates that compounded monthly. Within a year, the family faced foreclosure. Sonny made a decision that would scandalize British society but save the dynasty. He married for money. In 1895, before his father's death, Sonny had been introduced to Consuelo Vanderbilt, the daughter of American railroad magnate William Kissam Vanderbilt. Consuelo's family wealth was almost incomprehensible, over $7 billion in today's currency. Her dowry alone was valued at £80 million, adjusted for inflation. It was a transactional marriage. Consuelo later described it as brutal in her autobiography. Sonny used her money to pay off the Blenheim debts, restore the palace's finances, and stabilize the estate. In return, Consuelo became a duchess and lived in a gilded prison. The lake wing was never completed. The excavation was partially filled in and left as a shallow, irregular pond. The stone foundations of the unfinished wing were dismantled, and the materials were sold. The dream died with George. Before moving on, ask yourself this: at what point does ambition become a form of violence against the people we love? The workers who dug that lake had names. They had families. And they were the first casualties of the Duke's vision, long before his son drowned. Estate records from 1891 and 1892, buried in the Blenheim archives and digitized only in the last decade, reveal the human cost of the excavation. During the 16 months of construction, 12 laborers were injured seriously enough to be listed in the estate's medical ledgers. 3 died. 1, a man named Thomas Harlow, age 34, was crushed when an embankment collapsed. Another, William Poole, age 22, died from infection after a pickaxe wound to his leg went untreated. The third, James Whitmore, age 41, died from exhaustion and heatstroke during a 14-hour shift in the summer of 1891. None of their deaths halted construction. None of their families received compensation. The estate's legal team classified the deaths as accidental misadventure, a term that absolved the employer of liability. The widows were evicted from workers' housing within weeks. The children were sent to workhouses. The Duke never knew their names. But their death subsidized his dream just as surely as the capital he allocated from his family fortune. This is the uncomfortable mathematics of generational wealth. It's not just about inheritance tax and asset allocation. It's about whose labor is valued and whose death is ignored. If this made you pause, that pause matters. The tragedy of George's drowning eclipsed everything. The narrative became about a grieving family, a father's guilt, and a dynasty's survival. The workers were erased. Their names don't appear on memorials. There is no plaque at Blenheim commemorating the men who died building a playground for aristocrats. But the financial mechanics of the collapse are worth examining, because they reveal how fragile even the wealthiest families can be when ambition outpaces liquidity. The 8th Duke's asset allocation strategy was fundamentally flawed. He treated Blenheim as an inexhaustible resource, assuming that the estate's income would always cover expansion. He didn't account for economic volatility. The British agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had already eroded tenant farm revenues. Grain prices collapsed due to cheap imports from America. Tenant farmers couldn't pay rent. The Duke responded by borrowing against the estate's future income, using the palace itself as collateral. By the time the Lake Wing project began, the estate was leveraged to a degree that would trigger immediate insolvency if income dropped even marginally. The drowning didn't cause the financial collapse. It accelerated a process that was already underway. When Sonny took over, he conducted a full audit of the estate's finances. The results were devastating. The family's total debt load was approximately £250 million in today's currency. Annual debt service, just the interest payments, consumed $6 million per year. The estate was in a death spiral. Without Consuelo Vanderbilt's dowry, Blenheim would have been foreclosed by 1898. The irony is that Sonny's arranged marriage saved the dynasty but destroyed his personal life. He and Consuelo had 2 sons, but the marriage was loveless and bitter. They separated in 1906 and divorced in 1921, one of the first high-profile aristocratic divorces in British history. Consuelo walked away from the title and moved to France, where she remarried and lived quietly. Sonny remarried as well, but he never recovered emotionally from the forced transaction that saved his inheritance. The lake wing remained unfinished for over a century. The shallow pond created by the aborted excavation gradually filled with silt and vegetation. By the 1950s, it was barely recognizable as a man-made feature. The estate, now managed by the 11th Duke and eventually opened to the public, never acknowledged the project in official histories. Tour guides didn't mention it. Architectural historians omitted it from surveys of Vanborough's work. The lake wing became a ghost, a phantom limb of ambition that was amputated and then forgotten. But the story didn't end there. In 1988, during routine maintenance on the southern grounds, workers discovered the original foundation stones of the lake wing buried under decades of overgrowth. An archaeologist was brought in to assess the site, and he uncovered blueprints sealed in a waterproof case beneath the cornerstone. The plans were exquisite. The lake wing, if completed, would have been one of the most innovative architectural achievements of the Victorian era, a fusion of Baroque grandeur and romantic naturalism, with indoor-outdoor water integration that prefigured modernist design by half a century. The architect's notes included cost projections, material specifications, and a personal letter from the 8th Duke describing his vision, a palace that embraces the landscape, not dominates it. The discovery reignited interest in the project. Architectural journals published features. Historians debated whether the design could have been structurally sound. Proposals were floated to complete the wing as a modern addition to the palace. But the 11th Duke refused. He issued a statement saying that the lake wing would remain unfinished as a memorial to George Spencer-Churchill, whose death had prevented its construction. It was a polite fiction. The truth was simpler: the estate couldn't afford it. Even in the late 20th century, Blenheim was financially fragile. The palace required constant maintenance. The roof alone cost millions to repair. Tourism revenue helped, but it didn't cover operating costs. Completing the lake wing would have required external financing, and no bank was willing to lend against a historical estate with limited income potential. So the foundations were reburied. The pond was left as it was. And the lake wing returned to its status as an architectural legend, a project so ambitious it killed the boy who might have inherited it. If you're still here, you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because you sense that these stories reveal something essential about the psychology of wealth and the violence of ambition. Let's talk about the Duke's psychology. Modern psychological analysis of the 8th Duke's behavior, based on his correspondence, household staff testimony, and medical records, suggests he suffered from what we now recognize as acute guilt-driven depression with obsessive-compulsive features. His fixation on the lake as cursed was a cognitive distortion, a way of externalizing blame that he couldn't direct at himself. He couldn't accept that his ambition had created the conditions for his son's death. So he projected the guilt onto the project, onto the estate, onto Blenheim itself. This is a common pattern among the ultra-wealthy. When their decisions lead to catastrophic outcomes, they often construct elaborate narratives to avoid accountability. They blame market forces, bad luck, or cosmic forces, anything except their own choices. The Duke's nightly wanderings, his muttering about debts, and his eventual stroke all point to a man consumed by cognitive dissonance. He wanted to be remembered as a great builder, a visionary Duke who expanded Blenheim's glory. Instead, he would be remembered as the father who lost his son to his own ambition. But here's the deeper tragedy: the Duke's guilt was performative. He never acknowledged the workers who died. He never compensated their families. His guilt was reserved exclusively for his own child, his own lineage. The class divide was so absolute that the deaths of laborers didn't register as moral failures. They were business expenses. This selective empathy is the psychological foundation of dynastic wealth. You can only maintain generational fortunes if you compartmentalize suffering, if you mourn your own losses while ignoring the losses you inflict on others. Consuelo Vanderbilt's autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952, offers a brutal window into life at Blenheim after the tragedy. She describes the palace as a mausoleum where every corridor seemed to echo with unspoken grief. She writes about Sonny's emotional detachment, his obsessive focus on financial ledgers, and his inability to connect with their children. She recounts a conversation in which Sonny admitted that he couldn't look at the southern grounds without seeing his younger brother's face. But she also writes about the servants, the invisible army that kept the palace running. She describes a kitchen maid named Mary who worked 18-hour days for wages that barely covered her room and board. She describes a groundskeeper named Albert who had lost 2 fingers in a gardening accident and received no medical care. She describes the gap between the public grandeur of Blenheim and the private misery of the people who sustained it. Consuelo's empathy was unusual for her class. Most aristocrats didn't notice the servants. They were part of the architecture, functional, replaceable, and unremarkable. But Consuelo had grown up in America, where the nouveau riche hadn't yet perfected the art of invisible labor. She saw the cost. And she concluded that Blenheim wasn't worth it. After her divorce, Consuelo used her wealth, reclaimed through a complex legal settlement, to fund social welfare projects in France and England. She built housing for workers. She supported labor rights organizations. She publicly criticized the British aristocracy's reliance on exploitative labor practices. She became, in effect, a class traitor. The Marlborough family never forgave her. The psychological cost of the drowning extended beyond the Duke. It shaped Sonny's entire worldview. He became obsessed with financial solvency, not as a means to an end but as an end in itself. He saw wealth as the only defense against chaos. He taught his sons, the 10th and 11th Dukes, that the estate's survival was the family's highest moral obligation. Everything else was secondary. This is how trauma becomes dynasty. The original wound, the drowning, the guilt, the financial collapse, gets encoded into family mythology. Future generations inherit not just the wealth but the psychological patterns that created it. The 10th Duke, John Albert William Spencer-Churchill, inherited Blenheim in 1934 during the Great Depression. The estate was again on the brink of insolvency. Income from tenant farms had collapsed. Inheritance tax, introduced in 1894 and steadily increased, consumed 40% of the estate's value upon each transfer of title. John's solution was to open Blenheim to the public. In 1950, the palace became one of the first privately owned heritage sites in England to charge admission. Tourism revenue stabilized the finances, but it also transformed the estate into a commercial enterprise. The Duke's private apartments became museum exhibits. Family heirlooms were roped off and labeled. The dining room where George's death was announced became a ticketed attraction. The tragedy was commodified. And the lake wing. It became a ghost story for tour guides to whisper about. The Duke's son drowned during construction, and the wing was abandoned. The details were omitted. The workers were never mentioned. The story was simplified into a cautionary tale about hubris and loss. But the reality was more complex. The lake wing wasn't abandoned because of grief. It was abandoned because the finances collapsed. The drowning was the catalyst, but the underlying cause was a century of financial mismanagement, over-leverage, and a refusal to adapt to changing economic realities. The British aristocracy entered the 20th century as the wealthiest class in history. They exited it as relics. Death duties, land reform, and the dismantling of the agricultural economy destroyed the economic foundation of dynastic estates. By 1980, over half of England's great houses had been demolished, sold, or converted into schools and hotels. Blenheim survived because of tourism, but it survived as a museum, not a home. The 11th Duke, John George Vanderbilt Henry Spencer-Churchill, inherited the estate in 1972 and spent his entire life fighting to preserve it. He modernized the management, expanded the tourism infrastructure, and negotiated tax breaks with the government. He also commissioned a private historian to compile a complete archive of the estate's financial records, including the Lake Wing project. The archive, completed in 2003, runs to over 12,000 pages. It includes contracts, ledgers, correspondence, and medical records. It documents every shilling spent on the excavation, every injury, every death. It's one of the most complete financial and human records of a Victorian construction project ever compiled. And it's not available to the public. The 12th Duke, Charles James Spencer-Churchill, who inherited in 2014, has kept the archive sealed. The official reason is privacy concerns for descendants of estate workers. The unofficial reason is that the archive reveals the true cost of Blenheim's construction, not just in pounds sterling but in human life. The Lake Wing, in other words, is still too dangerous to expose. These stories exist in the silence between the official histories and the sealed archives. They require patience, skepticism, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Now let's pull back and examine the broader context, the Gilded Age economics that made projects like the Lake Wing possible in the first place. The late Victorian era was the apex of British imperial wealth. The empire controlled 1/4 of the world's landmass and 1/5 of its population. Capital flowed into London from colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The British aristocracy, positioned at the top of this extractive system, accumulated fortunes that were unprecedented in scale. But the wealth was unevenly distributed. While the dukes and earls built palaces, the working class lived in squalor. Urban poverty in London, Manchester, and Liverpool was catastrophic. Child mortality rates in working-class neighborhoods exceeded 50%. Workhouses were overflowing. The gap between the richest and poorest citizens was wider than at any point in British history. The Lake Wing project was financed by this system. The Duke's income, derived from tenant farms, mining rights, and industrial investments, was ultimately extracted from the labor of thousands of people who would never set foot in Blenheim. The construction itself relied on workers who earned subsistence wages and had no legal protections. This wasn't unique to Blenheim. Every great estate in England operated the same way. But Blenheim's incomplete Lake Wing offers a rare window into the mechanics of the system because the project's failure left behind documentation that would normally be destroyed or buried. The contracts for the Lake Wing excavation, preserved in the estate archive, specified wages of 12 shillings per week for labourers, roughly equivalent to £200 per week in today's currency. A skilled mason earned 20 shillings, or about £330 per week. These were below market rates even for 1891. The contracts also included clauses that absolved the estate of liability for injury or death, required workers to live in estate-provided housing, at rents deducted from wages, and prohibited union organizing. The workers had no choice. Rural employment was scarce. The agricultural depression had driven thousands of farm laborers into desperate poverty. Working on the Lake Wing was better than starvation, even if it meant risking your life. This is the core mechanism of exploitation, creating conditions where people consent to dangerous labor because the alternative is worse. And the aristocracy didn't see it as exploitation. They saw it as paternalism. The Duke provided employment. He provided housing. He provided a doctor, albeit one who charged for visits and prioritized the family over the staff. In his worldview, he was being generous. This self-justification is central to understanding the psychology of the rich. They don't see themselves as exploiters. They see themselves as benefactors. The system is designed to obscure the extraction, to make it look like charity rather than theft. The financial statements for the Lake Wing project show that labor costs represented only 18% of the total budget. The majority, 54%, went to materials, stone, iron, glass, and luxury finishes. Another 22% went to architectural and engineering fees. The remaining 6% covered administrative costs, which included the Duke's travel expenses to consult with designers and the cost of hosting guests at Blenheim to showcase the plans. In other words, the people doing the actual work received less than 1/5 of the budget, while the people designing and socializing the project received nearly half. This is asset allocation as class violence. And when the project collapsed, who bore the cost? The laborers lost their jobs immediately. The suppliers were paid eventually, after legal battles. The architects and engineers negotiated settlements. The Duke's family absorbed the financial loss, but they absorbed it from a position of immense privilege. They still lived in a palace. They still had access to capital. They still had generational wealth. The workers had nothing. If this makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the beginning of clarity. Now let's talk about what happened to the site itself, the physical scar left by the Lake Wing. For decades, the unfinished excavation was a literal wound in the landscape. The partial lake flooded during heavy rains, creating a swampy, unstable mess. The embankments eroded, sending sediment into the River Glyme and damaging the water quality downstream. Local farmers complained that their fields flooded more frequently after the excavation. The estate ignored the complaints. In 1920, the ninth Duke, Charles Richard John Spencer-Churchill, Sonny's successor, commissioned a landscape architect to naturalize the site. The goal was to make the failed excavation look intentional, to integrate it into Capability Brown's original design as if it had always been there. Trees were planted around the edges. The water was stocked with ornamental fish. Walking paths were added. The shallow pond was rebranded as the Lower Lake, distinct from the Grand Lake that Brown had created in the 18th century. It was historical revisionism through landscaping. Tour guides at Blenheim today describe the Lower Lake as a romantic addition from the Victorian era. They don't mention the drowning unless asked directly, and even then, the story is sanitized. A tragic accident led to the abandonment of expansion plans, is the official line. The workers are never mentioned. The financial collapse is never mentioned. The half-finished foundations are never mentioned. The estate's public history has been carefully curated to remove anything that complicates the narrative of grandeur. But the physical evidence is still there, if you know where to look. In 2011, a team of industrial archaeologists conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the southern grounds as part of a research project on Victorian engineering. They discovered the buried foundations of the lake wing, massive stone pilings that extend 12 feet underground. They also discovered something unexpected, a secondary tunnel system beneath the foundations, likely intended for mechanical systems or storage. The tunnels were partially flooded. When the archaeologists drained one section, they found tools, shovels, pickaxes, iron spikes, abandoned in place. They also found graffiti scratched into the tunnel walls. Most of it was initials and dates. But one section, photographed and later published in an academic journal, read, "We built this for them and they will forget us." The author was likely one of the laborers who worked on the excavation. The date scratched next to it was June 1892, 1 month before George drowned. The inscription is now resealed underground. The estate refused permission for further excavation. The official reason was preservation of historical integrity. The real reason was that the tunnels complicate the narrative. They're evidence of the scale of labor involved, the conditions the workers endured, and the resentment they felt. History is not neutral. It's curated by the people with the power to control the archives. Let's return to George Spencer-Churchill, the boy whose death halted everything. Who was he, beyond the tragedy? The historical record on George is frustratingly sparse. He was born in 1880, the second son of the 8th Duke and Duchess. As the spare rather than the heir, he was largely overlooked in family correspondence. His tutors described him as bright but inattentive and prone to wandering. He had a fascination with natural history, he collected beetles and pressed flowers. He was known to spend hours in the estate's library reading travel narratives. In other words, he was a normal, curious child. The tragedy of his death isn't just that he drowned. It's that he drowned in a monument to his father's ego. The lake wasn't for George. It wasn't for the family's use, really. It was a status symbol, a way for the Duke to compete with other aristocratic estates. And George, wandering and unsupervised, became collateral damage. Child safety was not a priority in Victorian aristocratic households. Children were raised by nannies and governesses and were expected to stay out of sight. The Duke and Duchess saw their children at scheduled times, breakfast, tea, formal dinners. The rest of the day, the children were on their own. This wasn't neglect in the modern sense. It was the norm. But norms can be deadly. After George's death, the Duchess reportedly fired the governess on duty that day, a woman named Miss Langley, who had been with the family for 6 years. Miss Langley was dismissed without references, which made it nearly impossible for her to find future employment. There's no record of what happened to her after she left Blenheim. She disappears from the historical record entirely. This is another invisible casualty. The governess was blamed for a systemic failure, the decision to build a dangerous, unfenced excavation on the grounds of an estate where children lived. But she had no power to stop the construction. She had no authority to challenge the Duke's plans. She was responsible for supervising children in an environment designed without their safety in mind. And when tragedy struck, she was the one who paid. The psychology of scapegoating is central to how power protects itself. When systems fail, individuals are blamed. The people with the least power absorb the consequences, while the people with the most power remain untouchable. The Duke never faced legal consequences for George's death. There was no inquest that questioned his judgment in building the lake. No one asked why the site wasn't fenced or supervised. The coroner's report classified the drowning as accidental death by misadventure, a conclusion that absolved everyone in positions of authority. This is how wealth insulates itself from accountability. Now let's talk about what the lake wing represents in the broader history of British architecture and the aristocracy's relationship with modernity. The Victorian era was a period of radical technological and architectural innovation. The Industrial Revolution had introduced new materials, steel, plate glass, reinforced concrete, and new engineering techniques that made previously impossible structures achievable. The aristocracy was both fascinated and threatened by this modernity. They wanted to incorporate it into their estates, but they also wanted to maintain the visual language of historical grandeur. The lake wing was an attempt to reconcile these tensions. The design combined Baroque symmetry with Romantic naturalism and Victorian engineering. It was meant to be a showpiece, a demonstration that the old aristocracy could adapt and remain relevant. But it failed. And the failure is symbolic. The British aristocracy's inability to complete the lake wing mirrored their inability to adapt to the economic and social changes sweeping the country. They clung to the aesthetics of power, the palaces, the titles, the estates, but the substance was eroding. Their wealth was increasingly dependent on marriage to American heiresses, industrial investments, and eventually, tourism. They were no longer builders. They were curators of their own decline. The lake wing is the perfect metaphor for this. It's a grand vision, meticulously planned, partially executed, and ultimately abandoned. It's ambition without follow-through. It's wealth without resilience. And it's a monument to the human cost of maintaining appearances. Let's examine the aftermath for the family in the 20th century, because the drowning's impact rippled forward for generations. Sonny, the 9th Duke, lived until 1934. He remarried after divorcing Consuelo, but his second marriage was also unhappy. He became increasingly reclusive, spending his final years obsessing over the estate's finances. He died of a heart attack at age 62, and his estate, despite Consuelo's dowry, was still heavily indebted. Inheritance tax consumed 40% of the value, forcing his heir to sell more land and artwork. The 10th Duke, John, lived through World War II and saw Blenheim requisitioned by the British government as a training facility and storage depot. The requisition damaged the interiors and disrupted the estate's income. After the war, John had to petition Parliament for tax relief to prevent foreclosure. He succeeded, but only by agreeing to open the estate to the public permanently. The 11th Duke, also named John, spent his entire life fighting preservation battles. He modernized the estate's management, launched a major restoration campaign, and turned Blenheim into one of the most visited heritage sites in England. But he also had to make painful compromises. Parts of the estate were leased to commercial enterprises. The family's private apartments shrank. The palace stopped being a home and became a business. The 12th Duke, Charles, inherited in 2014. He's a businessman, not a traditionalist. He's launched high-end hospitality ventures on the estate, luxury accommodations, event rentals, fine dining. He's treated Blenheim as a brand, not a legacy. And he's been criticized for it by heritage purists who think he's vulgarizing the estate. But he's kept it solvent. That's the metric that matters. None of this would have been necessary if the lake wing had succeeded. If the project had been completed, if George hadn't drowned, if the finances hadn't collapsed, the family might have maintained their traditional aristocratic lifestyle for another generation or two. But the drowning was the catalyst that forced modernization. In a dark, ironic way, George's death saved Blenheim. It stopped a financially ruinous project and forced the family to confront reality. The palace survived because the dream died. But at what cost? Before we conclude, let's address the philosophical question at the heart of this story. What is the moral weight of ambition? The 8th Duke wanted to build something beautiful. That desire, in itself, isn't evil. The problem is that he pursued it without regard for the human cost. He treated workers as expendable. He ignored the financial risks. He prioritized his legacy over his family's safety. And when tragedy struck, he collapsed into guilt but never extended that guilt to the workers who had already died. This is the pattern we see again and again in stories of extreme wealth. Ambition becomes toxic when it's unmoored from accountability. When the people pursuing grand visions don't bear the consequences of failure, they take increasingly reckless risks. And the people who do bear the consequences, the workers, the families, the communities, are rendered invisible. The Lake Wing is a monument to that invisibility. It's also a reminder that history is written by survivors. The Marlborough family survived. Their story is preserved in archives, biographies, and tourist brochures. The workers didn't survive, not in the historical record, anyway. Their names are listed in ledgers, but their stories are lost. Unless we choose to remember them. If you're still with this story, it's because you understand that the spectacle is never the full story. The palace is impressive, but the cost of building it is what defines its meaning. The drowning is tragic, but the deaths that preceded it are what give the tragedy context. These are the stories that need to be told, even when they're uncomfortable. Especially when they're uncomfortable. The Lake Wing remains unfinished. The shallow pond is still there, surrounded by trees, stocked with fish, integrated into the landscape as if it were always part of the plan. Tourists walk past it every day without knowing what it represents. But now you know. You know that beneath the beauty is a foundation built on exploitation. You know that beneath the tragedy of a drowned child are the forgotten tragedies of crushed laborers. You know that the palace's survival required sacrifice, and that sacrifice was never equally distributed. And you know that the real question isn't whether the Lake Wing should have been completed. It's whether it should have been started at all. The 8th Duke of Marlborough wanted to be remembered as a visionary. Instead, he's remembered, by those who bother to look, as a man who loved a palace more than he loved the people who built it. More, even, than he protected his own child. That's the cost of ambition untethered from empathy. That's the dark side of wealth. And that's why these stories matter. If this story changed how you see the monuments of history, share it. Not for the algorithm, but because silence is how these truths stay buried. Every conversation is an act of remembering the people the archives tried to forget. And yet, the Lake Wing, in its state of deliberate, mutilated incompletion, holds a strange, inverted power. It is less an architectural failure and more a testament to the fact that some wounds are too deep to heal over with the polite landscaping of history. The shallow pond that remains is a scar, an anti-monument, a physical void in the heart of Blenheim's perfected landscape, permanently whispering the what if not of the Duke's grand vision, but of the collective amnesia that followed. We are left to ponder the perverse historical selection process by which the drowning of one aristocratic child becomes an eternal, gilded tragedy, freezing an entire construction project in time, while the deaths of 3 working men and the displacement of their widows are reduced to footnotes in a private ledger, safely sealed away by the 12th Duke in the name of privacy concerns, a shield of propriety designed not for the vulnerable, but for the powerful who wish to hide their ancestors. Complicity. This continued sealing of the archive is perhaps the cruelest act of the entire dynasty, a 21st-century echo of the original class violence, insisting that the truth of exploitation is still too dangerous to be a matter of public record, too destabilizing to the romance of the stately home. The archive contains the names, Thomas Harlow, William Poole, James Whitmore, and to keep those names locked away is to commit the act of forgetting anew, transforming the Lake Wing from a forgotten plan into a perpetually suppressed truth, a kind of architectural whitewashing that prefers the polite fiction of a father's broken heart to the vulgar truth of a system built on disposable labor and financial recklessness. The tragedy of George's drowning, while genuine, was weaponized by the family narrative, used to justify the abrupt financial reversal and to draw a sympathetic curtain over the deeper, structural rot that had consumed the estate's liquidity. The family's wealth was never as robust as the facade suggested, merely a precarious edifice of debt and overleveraged assets, a financial house of cards that the smallest tremor, a boy's fall into a half-dug pond, was enough to bring down. The true miracle isn't that Blenheim survived, but that the family found a way to externalize the cost of their survival, first by exploiting the workers, then by marrying an American fortune, and finally by commodifying their own history into a ticketed experience that carefully edits out the parts about debt and death. The ghost of the Lake Wing thus haunts not just the southern grounds of Blenheim, but the very nature of British dynastic memory. It stands as a powerful counter-narrative to the idea of inevitable aristocratic decline, revealing instead a long, grinding process of adaptation and moral compromise, where the highest value was always the preservation of the physical estate, even at the expense of marital happiness, consuelo, personal health, the 8th Duke, and basic human empathy. the inscription scratched into the buried tunnel walls by an anonymous laborer, "We built this for them and they will forget us," is a prophetic and devastating piece of counter-history, a lament of invisibility written on the very stone of the Duke's ambition, a truth that literally runs deeper than the sanctioned historical narrative. The fact that the estate immediately resealed this evidence, citing historical integrity, while simultaneously selling off portions of the palace's history in the gift shop, speaks volumes to the cynical calculus of modern heritage management. Only the digestible, glamorous, and non-accusatory past is permitted to surface. And this is where the story shifts from a historical footnote to a mirror for our own time, for the Lake Wing is a timeless metaphor for any grand, high-cost project, be it a palace extension, a corporate empire, or a piece of infrastructure, whose spectacle overshadows the ethics of its construction and the precarity of its financing. Every skyscraper, every outsourced supply chain, every massive government project has its own Lake Wing, a hidden cost borne by those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, a moral debt that is never accurately accounted for in the final ledger. We, the contemporary audience, are the tourists who walk by the artificially naturalized lower lake, admiring the view without knowing the names of the crushed, the sick, and the evicted whose suffering was the necessary precondition for the landscape's beauty. The question that remains is not why the Duke failed, but why, knowing the mechanics of this system, we continue to allow ourselves to be complicit in the forgetting. The ultimate victory of the Marlborough dynasty is not that they saved their palace with a Vanderbilt dowry, but that they successfully encoded their selective empathy into the official history, teaching us, the inheritors of that narrative, to mourn the loss of a boy whose tragedy was a political spectacle, while remaining utterly oblivious to the systemic violence inflicted upon the men who died quietly building the stage for that spectacle. If the archive remains sealed, then our job is not to wait for the Duke's permission, but to speak the forgotten names, Harlow, Poole, Whitmore, into every space the silence has tried to claim, making this conversation itself the truest and most enduring memorial.